In my very first video, I suggested that I do like a ranking video of Elton John albums, and here it is. In this video, I'll cover my top 10 favorite Elton John albums, counting from number 10 down, as it were, to number 1. And I'm going to call these top 10 favorites of mine the positively golden albums, because to me, they really are. Elton is my golden god of music, and these are, and again, I say only for me anyway, his most golden albums. And as far as covering numbers 1 through 10 goes, this is how I'm going to set things up. For each album in my list, I'll talk a bit about the album, when it was released, maybe a bit about what my reaction was the first time I heard it, and why it's a favorite of mine, and so on. And for each album, I'll also showcase one vinyl copy that is in some way noteworthy. But for the sake of time, I'll not go into too much detail about the particular copy I choose. Right after I finish shooting this, I'm going to do like a companion video to this first part and talk more about the showcase copies and why they're noteworthy, which pressings they are, and that kind of thing, and offer some tips for collectors. Okay, here we go. For me, this album will always seem a little bittersweet because when I heard it the first time, I knew straight away that it was one hell of an album. Great writing, great performances, great production, even great artwork and design. But it was released just weeks after 9/11, and nowadays when I hear just about any of its songs, I think of that period. But certainly over the years, I've never changed my high opinion of the album. As an album, it's still a great listen, never gets old, and as you might have already guessed, I'm referring to the glorious Patrick Leonard produced Songs from the West Coast, released in October 2001. This album was recorded in Los Angeles and London. This album also marks when the great Nigel Olsson returned to the Elton John band. Elton's always worked with first-class drummers, like Roger Pope was also a really amazing drummer. But Nigel is Nigel and was so much a part of what made those classic years Elton albums back in the 70s just so breathtaking. This album musically was a return to form for Elton after having done one or two really great things in the 90s, but then releasing some stinkers too that decade. And I think he knew it, and he made a conscious decision to invest more time and interest into recording his studio albums, and it really paid off here. And so in my mind, Songs from the West Coast marks the beginning of a period in Elton's career that I like to call his back to basics period, where his studio albums adopt a much earthier sound, the kind that we hear on many of those early 70s albums. Even the great Paul Buckmaster provided string arrangements for this album. So for those of you that really love the self-titled Elton John, Tumbleweed, Friends, and Madman period especially, if you haven't heard Songs from the West Coast, you may wish to change that. At least give Mansfield a spin, because that track alone, I think, shows just how well this album recaptured that classic sound, and without it sounding forced or calculated. So I really, really love just about all the songs in this album, but my absolute favorite songs from this one include Dark Diamond, Original Sin, Birds, I Want Love, About of the Boy in the Red Shoes, Lover Like Me, Mansfield, and This Train Don't Stop There Anymore. I also really, really, really love two of the album's non-LP B-sides, The North Star and Did Anybody Sleep with Joan of Arc? And that can often be a strong indicator of a truly great album, when even its non-LP outtakes, whether they become B-sides or bonus tracks of some kind, are themselves so good that you consider them an indispensable part of the album's sort of experience. I currently have only one vinyl copy. There's really only one vinyl edition to have anyway, and two CD copies. And the copy I'm showing you here is that one vinyl copy, the double vinyl issue, which was first released in late 2016 as part of sort of a limited box set, but then received a much more general release in early 2017. Anyway, remember, I'll talk more about that kind of collector's stuff in the other video. Number nine. I remember learning about this album maybe about just a month before it came out. One afternoon in early 1995, I was sitting there flipping channels, and I came across the lead singles video by accident. I absolutely loved the song. That was the first new Elton single that I ever bought on CD single rather than on cassette single. And that album is, as I'm sure some of you may have guessed by now, the stupendously good Made in England, originally released in March 1995. It was co-produced by Elton himself and the wonderfully talented Greg Penny, the latter of whom I think probably left more of his mark on this album in terms of production style than maybe Elton did. But anyway, I remember the day I bought my first copy, and I remember playing that CD copy for the first time, front to back, and I wasn't really sure of what to expect. 3 years earlier, when Elton had released The One really wasn't an album that I felt had a lot of cohesion to it, you know, when the album is more than just the sum of its parts. So when I heard Made in England for the first time, I was overjoyed. It had that kind of cohesion, that spirit to it, and it still has it. This album seems as new and fresh to me now as it did in 1995. The songwriting is very, very strong, and the production is just outstanding. And favorite tracks include, you know, Believe, Made in England, Cold, Belfast, Please, Man, and Latitude. In fact, Latitude is probably my favorite Elton John song from the 90s. And Paul Buckmaster's here too. He did string arrangements, but it was George Martin that did the string arrangement for Latitude. And the album was actually recorded in 1994 at Air Studios in London, which belonged to George Martin at the time. Anyway, I currently have 2 different vinyl copies and 3 CD copies of Made in England in my collection, and this here is my original 1995 UK Rocket vinyl copy. My number 8 is the self-titled Elton John album, and it was originally released in April 1970 in the UK on DJM Records. And then a few months later I think Uni Records finally, in the US and Canada, finally shipped its first copies in June or July. Now this album was not a favorite of mine from the beginning. I didn't actually get my first copy of this album until January 1991. And hearing it for the first time, I didn't like it very much. I knew Your Song and Border Song from the Greatest Hits album, but I didn't really associate those songs with any other album other than Greatest Hits. I also knew some of the songs already because of the Live in Australia album, which I loved very much, but at that point I really preferred the Live in Australia versions. I remember I really hated The Cage, which is strange because nowadays it's a contender as probably my favorite song on the album. I really did fall in love with First Episode at Hyanton, but other than that, you know, that first copy sat in my collection for years, pretty much unplayed. Over the years, obviously, my opinion has changed. I've come to really appreciate and enjoy the original versions of the songs that he performed on the Live in Australia album, and you know, I've really learned to love and respect the album more and more. That said, you know, this album didn't really begin its climb anywhere near my top 10 list until about maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and I heard Greg Penny's 5.1 surround remix of this album for the first time. And the 5.1 surround mix of this album is easily one of my 2 or 3 favorites of all the Elton John albums available in 5.1. This was the first album that Elton John did with producer Gus Dudgeon, and also his first working with string arranger Paul Buckmaster. And I pretty much adore all the songs on this album. I also love 2 of its non-LP B-sides, the original version of Grey Seal and Bad Side of the Moon, which as a Canadian I would be remiss if I didn't mention that 70s Canadian band April Wine actually did a cover version of Bad Side of the Moon 2 years later and had a big hit with it. But it's not just the songs. For this album, it's also the career context. This was not Elton's first album worldwide, but it was his first album in North America. And it became his breakout album in the United States. The only one actually available in stores when he made his American debut at the Troubadour Los Angeles in August 1970. So this was the album that people bought when, you know, Elton experienced that initial explosion of attention and acclaim. Now I currently have 19 different vinyl copies and 10 different CD copies of the self-titled Elton John album. And this is my 1970 US Uni Records Monarch pressing, which was a contract pressing done at Monarch Records in Los Angeles, and as such was one of the very earliest North American pressings of any Elton John album. My Man Across the Water, originally released November 1971 on DJM in the UK and on Uni Records in the US and Canada. This one's very personal to me because it was the album that I fell in love with when I was a kid, and the one that motivated me to, you know, seek more Elton music. I don't think that I need to discuss too much why I love this album, so much. It tends to be among many people's favorite Elton John albums. It also contains Tiny Dancer and Leave On and the title track and Indian Sunset. I currently have in my collection 8 different vinyl copies of Madman and 9 different copies on CD. This vinyl copy here is one of the very limited 50th anniversary splatter vinyl pressings that the creative people at Vinyl Me Please did back in 2022. On top of being limited, this vinyl edition of Madman has a very rare distinction among all vinyl copies of any Elton John album, and I'll discuss that distinction more in the other video. Sleeping with the Past, originally released in August 1989 on Rocket in the UK and on MCA Records in the US and Canada. Sleeping with the Past was Elton and Bernie's tribute to the R&B and soul records that they loved so much when they were younger. It's not really an R&B or soul album per se, but it was at least influenced by those genres. And many people will know this album for the song Sacrifice, which was Elton's first UK solo #1 single, and was, of course, the basis for the smash hit remix mashup track Cold Heart, which Elton did with Dua Lipa and Pinal back in 2021, and which also became a UK #1 single for Elton. Much as I love it, Sacrifice doesn't really fit the album's mood as well as, you know, all the other tracks do, but I love all this album's songs. I wouldn't say there's one dud or skip song, at least not for me. Healing Hands and Club at the End of the Street were the other 2 hit singles from this album at the time. Blue Avenue, which is the album's playout track, maybe should have been a single in a major territory at least. It's not my all-time favorite Elton John and Bernie Taupin song, but I'd say it's a serious contender for sure. I have 6 different vinyl copies from around the world and 5 different copies on CD. This copy here, well actually, I'm not gonna tell you in this video which vinyl copy this is, but I will tell you this is the best sounding copy of Sleeping with the Past that I own on any format. And I'll explain what copy this is and why I think it sounds so good in my other video. Too Low for Zero, Elton's 1983 pop triumph, and the beginning of what I like to call his 80s Renaissance period, and also the album that reunited him with his classic years band, Davy Johnstone, also bassist Dean Murray and drummer Nigel Olsson. This was the first time since the last of the Captain Fantastic sessions in late 1974 that those 4 guys had, you know, stood together in the same recording studio. And this was also the first album that Elton had done since 1976 that was all John and Taupin songs. From 1978 to 82, Elton worked with several different lyricists, and with Bernie too, but again, this album brought Bernie back full time. That said, Gus Dudgeon didn't return as producer. Too Low for Zero was produced by Chris Thomas, who had begun producing Elton's albums back in 1981, and Chris Thomas did just a fantastic job of Too Low for Zero. I remember getting my copy of Greatest Hits Volume 3, you know, when I was a kid, and realizing a little later on that maybe a good third of that compilation's songs, so I'm Still Standing, Kiss the Bride, and one of my all-time favorite Elton John songs, I guess that's why they call it the blues, and also the song Too Low for Zero, which I don't think was actually a hit anywhere, but that's another discussion. You know, I realized that a good maybe third of the songs on Greatest Hits Volume 3 came originally from Too Low for Zero. Then I got my first copy, and I remember thinking, well, there's no way that the other songs on the album are going to be as good as, you know, the songs that were the big hits. So I played it, and you know, just right out of the gate, the album's opening track, Cold as Christmas, just floored me. And I was too young to really know what the song was about. It was just the feel of the track, the melody, the sound of Elton's voice. You know, I got goosebumps. And I remember I just kept rewinding the tape to play that song again and again. I had a new favorite song, and I hadn't even played the whole album yet. But you know, soon I fell just as in love with other album songs like Crystal, One More Arrow, and most especially Saint, which I just adore. This is just such a great album. Too Low for Zero was a landmark for Elton. Some people have called it a comeback album, but he never really went away, did he? And the album, eventually did well commercially. But at the time of its release, it took a while to gain some traction. It eventually became a top 10 album in the Australian and UK charts, but it didn't actually at any point break even the top 20 in the US. But the hit singles from Too Low and their accompanying music videos made quite an impact. And Elton most definitely entered a new stage in his career with this album. And what an album. This should have been a US top 10 album for him. The album deserved it anyway. I have 7 different vinyl copies of Too Low for Zero and 6 on compact disc. And this copy here is actually not a vintage issue. It's the 2016 reissue, which is a great copy to have if you're going to have just one copy of Too Low for Zero. But then why stop at just one copy? I have somewhere on an old audio tape a recording of me, age 9, and I'm screaming to a microphone. What is it? Sydney, Australia, New Zealand, God bless. We love you. Thank you very much. Good night. Audience cheering. What's that from? That was Elton's sign-off at the end of his December 14th, 1986 show at the Sydney Entertainment Centre in Australia. The show that was the last of his 2-month tour of Australia with one of Australia's most respected ensembles, the 88-piece Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. And that performance also formed the basis of the 3rd official live album of Elton's catalogue, Live in Australia with the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra, released in 1987 on Rocket in the UK and on MCA in the US and Canada. The tour with the Melbourne Symphony had been called the Tour de Force, and although Elton's new studio album that year, Leather Jackets, wasn't exactly a runaway success, what Elton was perhaps lacking in the studio around this time, he more than made up for with his live shows. And he played the piano in those days like a giant, and I would say this period for him was his zenith as a live performer. And in the second half of this show, on comes the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra, and throughout that second half, Elton revisits a lot of his 70s catalog with the orchestra accompanying him, and not just hits either, lesser known album tracks too. And conducting the orchestra for this tour was the one, the only, James Newton Howard. The final album comprised the best of the second half of the show, and the album's big hit was its live version of Candle in the Wind. And you may say to yourself, well, hold it, but I don't remember there being an orchestra on the original Candle in the Wind. And you're absolutely correct, nor was there one on the Live in Australia version, which is kind of ironic since the whole point of this was to perform with an orchestra. Candle in the Wind on here is the only of the 14 tracks not to feature the Melbourne Symphony and was really the album's only big hit. And one last thing before I move on, Elton's voice was not in good shape for the 1986 Australian tour. It was actually just after the tour that Elton went in for emergency surgery on his throat. Turned out he had some benign polyps on his vocal cords. But the point is, this was just before that, and he doesn't sound much like himself at all vocally on this album, and it kind of sounds almost like Joan Rivers. It's a very, very husky kind of voice, and I know fans that really don't like this album for that reason, but I think it's part of the album's charm, really. Roger Daltrey put it best, I think, in 1991. He was interviewed for the Two Rooms project, and in that interview he discussed his admiration for this album. He said, I'm paraphrasing here, he said, here's this guy who's blown his voice out playing all these ridiculously long shows, but there he is and he's still going. And that sums up what I really love about the man. He's got balls. And I agree, Live in Australia certainly has, a determination about it that really makes the album. It was an ambitious project from the very beginning, and despite Elton's voice problems, you can tell that he wanted to do the best show he could, and the result was, for my money anyway, I think this is my most favorite live album that anyone's ever made. Surprisingly, I don't have too many copies of this. I have only 4 vinyl copies and about 3 different CD copies of Live in Australia. This is my original 1987 UK Rocket double vinyl copy, which actually came with a limited box set packaging, which also included a bonus booklet about the '86 tour with the orchestra, and I'll show the box and the record to you in that other video. This next one, my number 3, will probably raise some eyebrows. I'm sure some of my other choices have already raised some eyebrows, but this one will probably raise the most eyebrows. And this album pretty much never appears on ranked lists of Elton's best albums or anyone's favorite Elton John albums, but for many years now it's been on my top 10 list of favorite Elton John albums, but only recently have I found the courage to admit it. A lot of people, dismiss the album as a kind of misfire, or at best it was a transitional album that had to happen so that Elton could move on to better things. But to me, this album is a solid gem, and that album is The Fox, which was released in May 1981 on Rocket in the UK, and on Geffen here in the US and Canada. It was actually Elton's first album on the Geffen label. I don't really know where to begin with this. It's like a one-disc Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, in that the songs have a lot of variety. They're different styles, different moods, from straight pop to blues to even classical. The Carla Etude instrumental suite that opens side 2 is probably my favorite piece of music that Elton's ever written. I love the album's sequencing, just the way things go up and down, but the energy's always there. The beautiful Elton song is here, whose lyrics were written by Tom Robinson. Elton worked with several lyricists on this album: Gary Osborne, Tom Robinson, and Bernie too. I think that the variety of collaborators really strengthened the album. The album's title track, The Fox, which is also the album's play-out song, is, as far as words and music tracks go, my favorite song on the album. It's like a country lullaby. It's a Bernie song too, and it's unquestionably one of my favorite Bernie Taupin lyrics. Well, every track on this album is, I think, a solid winner for me. I just love this album. And I may not be as alone as I think, at least not anymore. Over the past few years, it seems that other fans have opened up about how they feel about The Fox, including fans in high places too. For example, Rich Wilhelm, writing for PopMatters.com, wrote and published a wonderful tribute to the Fox album back in 2021. In fact, Pop Matters published that story on May 20th, 2021. That was 40 years to the day that The Fox was originally released. And the article's title was A Fascinating Cross, Elton John's The Fox at 40. And it's a great read. It's a great introduction to the album, and I'll add a link to that article in the video description. Last but not least, although this album was not a great commercial success for Elton, at least not in North America, it did receive many positive reviews at the time. And one of my favorite headlines from any contemporary critical review of an Elton John album is from Brown Burnett's, published in the Jackson Daily News and Clarion Ledger, both papers of Jackson, Mississippi. And the headline read, "Elton John comes roaring back, way back." And Burnett's review is basically a love letter to the album, and I'll just read the closing paragraph. "The Fox is a triumphant return for Elton John. The arrangements, the production, the musicians, and the songs are superb. And as for Elton, he is still the Elton of old, singing and playing with as much style and power as ever." So at present, I have 8 different vinyl copies of The Fox and only three different CD copies. This vinyl copy here is one of my favorite and best sounding copies of The Fox on any format, and it's actually a Canadian pressing. In the other video, I'll tell you which manufacturer pressed this. The Fox is one of only 2 Elton John albums that I know of anyway that this manufacturer ever pressed. So I'll talk more about that in the other video. All right, so my last 2 choices really won't surprise most people. And because so much has already been said by others about why these two albums are so great. I won't get into too much of that here. So for the sake of time and wrapping this video up, I'll keep my remaining comments brief. And number 2 on my list is Captain Fantastic and the Brown Dirt Cowboy, Elton and Bernie's autobiographical concept album, released worldwide in May 1975 on DJM Records in the UK and on MCA in the US and Canada. This album made history. It was the first album by anyone to enter the US Billboard Albums chart at #1. No one had ever done that before. And it stayed there for, I think, about 7 or 8 weeks. And, you know, when you consider that this album, at a time when Elton usually pulled at least 2 or 3 singles from each of his studio albums, when you consider that Captain Fantastic had only 1 single from it in the UK and in North America, and that was Someone Saved My Life Tonight, the album's chart success seems, you know, all the more impressive. But this was 1975, and Elton was at his all-time high as pop rock's premier artist. As Bernie Taupin described it, you couldn't even sneeze without hearing the name Elton John. I can tell you the day I got my first copy of this album. It was Saturday, June 24th, 1989. And I can remember, you know, getting home and putting it on the family stereo and playing the whole thing front to back and sitting there and listening song by song in absolute wonder. And since then, I've never, ever tired of hearing this album. Never. Some of Bernie Taupin's best lines, I'd say, are on this album, which is saying a lot because the man's had, you know, a 60-year career of best lines. But some of the songs on this album, you know, in particular, get me choked up. We All Fall in Love Sometimes and Curtains, you know, being probably the best 2 examples of that. It's just, it's a breathtaking album. It really is. And arguably the best album Elton ever released in terms of its artwork and packaging concept. I have 6 different vinyl copies of Captain Fantastic and 8 copies on CD. This vinyl copy here is my original 1975 Japanese DJM copy. It's missing its obi, unfortunately, which would have been about right here. Anyway, I'll talk more about this pressing in the other video. This is it. My #1 all-time favorite Elton John album. And I think it'll surprise no one, you know, which album it is. And that album is, of course, the legendary Leather Jacket. I'm just kidding. That was a joke. No, you know, it's good. Of course, it's Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. It's been my favorite album of all time by anyone since I was 8 years old. There's really only been one album by another artist or band that seriously threatened Yellow Brick Road's status as my all-time favorite album ever made, and that was Radiohead's OK Computer, and I was in high school at the time. It didn't quite knock Yellow Brick Road from its perch. Almost, but not quite. I bought my first copy of Yellow Brick Road on Saturday, December 3rd, 1988. I'll never forget that. And hearing Funeral for a Friend, Love Lies Bleeding for the first time was a life-changing experience for me. It really was. 2 months before, you know, I'd fallen in love with Madman Across the Water and decided that Elton was my new favorite music guy. But hearing Yellow Brick Road was the experience that made him my golden god of music for life. Now, if I continue talking about Yellow Brick Road, I probably won't be able to stop. Yeah, Elton himself once called it the ultimate Elton John album. You know, it's been the subject of at least 2 documentaries. It turns up frequently on people's lists of, you know, greatest pop rock albums ever made. It's Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, and it's a legend. There never was, and there'll never be another album quite like it. And there never was, and there will never be another quite like Sir Elton John. Thanks for watching this video. If you want to know more about these copies that I showed you throughout this video, make sure to watch the companion video to this one. If you like this video, please click like, and please consider subscribing to my channel because I really enjoy making all these videos so far, and I have many more videos to make for you. And as always, thank you.
Good night.
Sydney, Australia, New Zealand, God bless. We love you. Thank you very much. Good night.